this was just perfect that we were able to go through John's life. We did not plan this to happen on the 170th anniversary of his death. I didn't even realize it until Cody told me yesterday. So he's keeping me on my toes. And so I'm thrilled that we could honor him on that anniversary. Not one necessarily that he would want to remember, but you know, we do. So what I have is a little presentation on John. And it was interesting in that, I get this thing to advance. Ran across an article, I believe this was in the Church News not too long ago. It was actually for Pioneer Day. We missed Pioneer Day, sorry, but we are kind of doing our own Pioneer Day. Keith Erickson is a member of the church history department, not the family history department, but the church history. And he said Pioneer Day is a time for stories. Each year, storytellers, that's me. Storytellers surface and summarize devotionals or in Relief Society rooms in Provo. Around campfires, at family dinner tables, to regale the tales about noble ancestors, weary travelers, hardworking community builders. Such storytelling goes back to the pioneers themselves, who saying soon they'd have this tale to tell. But the pioneers' music also cherished truth as the fairest gem and the brightest prize. And most had converted to a new faith, which necessitated leaving behind family and traditions and homelands and the cause of truth. This year, may we honor the sacrifice of these pioneers by telling stories that are true, complete, and unvarnished as best we can. Okay. His final paragraph really resonated with me. Many pioneer stories do contain truth or true facts and meanings. Many of our pioneer ancestor stories in the Carter family fit this perfectly. They contain a lot of true facts and meaning and messages and meanings. I think this is one reason why people can feel eternal confirmations about them, because there is truth in them. Exaggeration can also make people feel angered by stories because there are errors in them. And believe me, the reason I'm here today is because I started noting those errors. And I said, you know, it's been 170 years now. It's time we start weeding out some of those errors and get the true story told about our ancestors. Because stories usually contain truth mingled with exaggeration, it's short-sighted to try to simply debunk them by turning them into myths. Instead, we should carefully analyze their contents. And the last couple of sentences is what I really want to focus on. This is why we're here today. We should cherish what is correct, the truth. Recover what's been omitted. And in many cases in our story, it's not what was omitted, it was what nobody ever bothered to go look for. It's amazing with the thousands and thousands of it. How many things are out there that nobody's ever seen? It's just amazing. And remove what was added later, nothing but the truth. And believe me, we have a lot of those things in our stories. Then we could serve another, then we could serve another slice of pie, or maybe we'll just have lunch today, while telling pioneer stories that are more than true. And so with that, we're going to tell the story of John Carter. John, who was born on May 19th, 1782 in Scarsboro, Maine, in that house. Now, not all that house, but on the right-hand side of that house, that is the original residence of Richard and Richard and Jane Carter, his parents. This is where they raised their 9 children. John came from a line of longtime Maine people and New England people in general, about 4 generations. And so this was the family home. It's still there on Broad Turn Road in Scarsboro, Maine. That was taken by me not that many years ago.
Well, Maine was before living in Maine for very long.
Well, yeah, Maine and New England also. Yeah. Okay, so the first story we have about John is we really know nothing about him when he was a little child, was that he was a mariner, supposedly. So I went searching to see if there was any way to prove that, and found that he actually bought a piece of land, or not a land, he bought a house with another gentleman who was a coach driver. So these two single guys in 1804 bought a house in Portland, which is just up the coastline from Scarsboro. So it was a big port in those days. John was listed as a mariner. So there was truth to the story. So John had bought a house in 1804. The date's significant. What happened shortly after that was what brought him out of marinering. And that was the fact that the British and the Americans were starting to have a little problem. That we had already ended the Revolutionary War. We thought that solved our problems, but it was only the beginning, because in 1806, just 2 years after John built that house, the British started putting what they called the non-intercourse acts in, where Americans could only trade with the British. And then they put a full embargo on the coastline, and that just shut down trade. Portland, Maine was the third largest port in America in 1804. By 1806, there was virtually no shipping going on there, except by pirate ships. And so it was really a whole change in the world for John. And so at this point, John obviously was getting out of being a mariner, probably moved back with his folks, and he found somebody to marry, Hannah Knight Libby, the girl that lived on the other side of the fence, literally. And they were married on the 2nd of March, 1806. And here comes yet another issue in our story. Archibald F. Bennett, who was the president of the Genealogy Society of Utah and the husband of Carter descendant, did our original genealogy. And I think he's too good a genealogist to have missed on this page the fact that up at the top in blue, it says this is the marriages of the second church starting in 1805. I can't believe he missed where the little blue box is in the middle, where it says, it said 1805 at the top, where it says 1806 in that little box. And then right below it is the marriage on the 2nd of March, early in the year of 1806. That's a significant date. I think Archibald Bennett's morals were a little more important than fact. I don't know. I may be accusing the man of the wrong thing, but he's the one that pushed that they had to be married in 1805, because you see, Dominicus was born about 4 months later. And so there was this little problem. And hey, if you do much genealogy, this is normal. This is what goes on. And not just now, but then. And so Hannah was in the childbearing way when they got married. Dominicus came right after that. And there was a story that he had married a Hannah Shute, or an Anna Shute, somewhere along this time period before Hannah. And there's no evidence of that anywhere. So I just tossed that part of the story out, because there's no record anywhere for them getting married. Okay, so actually, just prior to that marriage, he started buying land. And where he bought the land was very interesting. On this map, you'll see a yellow star. The yellow star is where that house is that Richard Carter owned, where John was born. That's the Carter homestead. The red dot, the red writing, is where Hannah's family lived. Now, they lived in different towns. They lived in different counties. The border is right between the two of them. And John was buying property like right between the two properties of the parents, because the properties he bought were part in Scarsboro and part in York. And so they were right on the border there. And it's the property for the Libby Farms on what's called Watson Mill Road. And if you go to Maine today, you would go up Broad Turn Road. If you kept going straight, you go to John's place or Richard's place. If you hung a left on this one road and turned around and went up the Mill Road, you'd go to the Libby's house, which is just about a mile apart. And so John started building or buying property to build this little farm, like right in between the two. One time he was labeled as living in Saco, which is the community on the would that be the left side of the line. Other times he was marked as being in Scarsboro because the property was split between Saco and Scarsboro. It was here that their first 3 children were born. And Hannah was very busy raising children. But at the very same time, John, who's just now bought this property, is already selling it off. Till eventually by 1809, he only owns a house and a little bit of property around the house. And he's been buying property up in a new place called Newry, which is up in the boonies in the mountains of Maine. And he's obviously planning to move. The thing about it is, if you've been there, in an area the size of this room, you could easily have 100 trees. You couldn't just move there and start farming. And so what's happened, I was reading stories about how that area was populated. People would buy the property, and then they would spend about 3 years improving the property before they ever moved onto it, because it would take that much time to cut all those trees, remove the stumps, and start clearing the land and building a house and all those things. So while John was doing those things probably in the spring and summer, Hannah was back at home tending the kids, but she had both families living on either side of her to help her. And the family was probably helping feed them and do all those kind of things. So it was a very busy time in the family until right around 1810, John finally makes the move and moves up to Newry. It was a huge community in those days. It had topped up to about 200 people. And they had a whole 200 people living there. I don't know if my mouse shows up on the screen. I don't see it. Okay. Well, yeah. If I walk away from this, then they can't hear me.
Oh, yeah, here, we just, can we stop share? And then say share. And then we're gonna do, is this screen two? Two, here we go, two.
Oh, okay, we got to get the right screen. Okay, now my mouse is showing. Okay. The highway that goes through there is across the bottom of the screen. And I can't remember the name of the river that it follows, but this line up here is the Bear River. Later in the story, we'll know about that because that's where Hannah was baptized. Okay, John bought this yellow property first. Then he started buying the kind of greenish, bluish colored properties here. And he also owned some property way over in the hills out here, woodland. And so he had a total of 100 and some odd acres at one point. He had quite a bit of land. Not that he used it, but it was here that all the rest of the family, starting with William, were born. William and Philip and the 2 Johns, Eliza, Richard, Mary Jane, and Rufus, were all born here. And later on in the story, we're going to see that Hannah was baptized. And since this is the only time you see the screen, understand their house was probably where that yellow pin is right there. And it's a half mile over to the river from where that yellow pin is, according to the maps. And that fits the story exactly, because they said that Hannah got up, walked a half mile to the river, and was baptized. And so everything falls into place. This was an early map. I got this from an early plot map of Newry, showing who bought which properties in the early days of the community. Okay, so they moved there. life was a little different there. They had come from a time period when they were pretty well off and all, and they've come to a place now where it's subsistence living. The people are isolated. You grow and raise what you need and make everything else yourselves. And probably within the community, there was a lot of bartering that went on. But it was really pretty much a subsistence level that the people were living at that time. And so it was not a fun experience. I'm sure it was a real challenge. And when you've got a large family like this, you've got a lot of mouths to feed. The fact that only 2 of the children die, I think, is a real testimony to the efforts that John made to keep everybody fed and healthy and all of that, because they went through the winter that the summer that never came in 1815. They were there during that time period, and they did lose the first John Harrison, probably from what happened with the weather that year. But that's all. Everybody else survived, so it was really a miracle. Okay. It was really fun to do something nobody else has ever done. And one of those things is to go read the town records. Nobody can see this but me, really. Now, I should tell you, I'm reading off a script. That script is a book I wrote on John, and it's found at Family Search. All you have to do is go to John and Family Search, go to his memories, and don't go look at stories. Look in the documents section for The Life of John Carter by Robert Givens, and it will say illustrated, because that's the one that will have the images. You can't get images down in the stories. And so with that one, you'll get images like this. And so what I did is I went and studied John through the time period that he was there, looking at what was in the town records. The town records had all the tax records, and they were basically taxed on land. Or not land, they were taxed on the animals. And so it would tell us like how many cattle, how many horses, how many oxen, how many hogs they had, and how much land was being used. So the average year for John was he had a horse for him. He had 2 oxen, because you need a couple of ox to pull your wagon, or plow the land. He'd have from anywhere from 1 to 5 head of cattle. You would imagine some of them would be for beef, some would be for milk. And then he'd have a pig or 2 at a time being raised for food, obviously. And then for land, even though he owned like 100 acres, he'd have usually about 1.5 acres that was tilled. So that's 1.5 acres that he was probably raising the food that they ate. That's probably where the foodstuffs were grown. He had usually about 2 acres of fallow land. And that would be where he was, grazing the cattle and the horses and, whatever animals, the oxen. And then that was about it. That was about all the land he used. He had 100 acres and he used maybe 4 acres of it. And remember, like I say, an area this size would have 100 trees in it. That's why he wasn't out there farming 80 acres. I mean, it would have taken him a century to get rid of all those trees. And so it was really an interesting story to be able to see behind the scenes what their life had to be like. This is a real challenge. I can't even imagine trying to do something like this, live off of about 3 acres, 4 acres of land and survive. Now, at the same time, John was a member of this community and he was an upstanding member. John, we never have learned much about, because he was, he was the non-member. He was the guy that said, oh, beat Dr. Bills, and that's all we know. John was an upstanding member of the community. He did all kinds of things. This is a list of the various jobs he was elected to in Newry between 1811 and 1838. And for most years, he was doing something. He was a busy guy. He was a highwayman. That doesn't mean he was a robber. That means he was out inspecting the highway. He was a fence inspector. He was a constable. He was the tax collector. He did just about everything you could think of. He was on committees for different things. He was a well-respected person in the community. And that might have led to why he wasn't really much in favor of joining the LDS Church, if you think about it. Because he knew that was probably going to cause some friction. And so, that might have been a reason why. Who knows? There's my prejudice coming into the story. And really isn't necessary, but I sometimes kind of, put my own thoughts about what was going on there. Okay, well, this brings us up to the Hannah story. And thank heavens for Eliza Jane. We have any Eliza Jane descendants here? One way back in the corner. Thank you for Eliza. I went to the church historian's office and saw her original diary. I don't know how they ever got this story because she wrote in pencil on an old little book. And today it's almost totally indecipherable. You can just see a word here and there. And the words seem to fit to the story. I did find where it said beats doctor bills. That I actually could read. That's still there in the story. But 15-year-old Eliza Jane was the only one who bothered to tell the story, or we wouldn't have the story today. Lane Carter is going to be talking about the baptisms of people later today, so I'm not going to take time going into all of them. But we know on the 4th of July, which I thought was kind of an interesting day for this to happen, that Hannah was dying. Apparently she had some disease and they had given up on her. When John Boynton and Daniel Bean, who happens to be their second cousin, showed up as Mormon missionaries and said, hey, can we see Hannah? And went in to see her and said, do you have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ? And she said, yes. And they said, can we lay our hands upon your head and heal you? And she said, go ahead. And they did. She got up, got dressed, and walked the half mile that you saw to the river. There's a postcard from late 1800s of the Bear River and what it looked like there. We were there in, I think it's July. So we were there in the middle of the summer, about the time of year when she was baptized. And the bottom picture is the picture I took of the Bear River there. And if they baptized her in it, I hope they found a fishing hole, because otherwise they'd have a real challenge. At least the year we were there wasn't much water. And so, but that's what the Bear River looks like. GPS is great. I was able to get a GPS for where I believe the house was. And I got out on the road and said, okay, where's this house? And it pointed me in the direction. And this house here on the road along the Bear River is just about smack dab exactly where you'd want to walk through, out through the woods, through private property, so we can't do it. And a half mile back in there would be where the Carters lived. And so that's about as close as I could get to the Carter property. But you can see how beautiful it is. Trees everywhere. So this activity caused the beginning of the schism in the family. This is where the family starts to split up. We'll leave it to Lane to talk about who gets baptized when. The real bottom line is, though, that come on in. You can build another front row if you want. We'll let you in here. We'll make sure we get everything out of the way. Just watch out for cords. And so from this time on, a large little, I guess, I can't say large little, that makes no sense. A large branch of the church started being raised here. Newry wasn't the center of it. Newry never had any churches. But just south of there, now I can't remember the name. What's just south of Newry? Bethel. Down in Bethel, was where the center of the church was, and it was a large growing congregation. And so they began to get visited by some people like Brigham Young and other members of the 12 between 1835 and 36. They had several visits by apostles, and the apostles started preaching the gathering, and they tried to get the saints to leave. And so this is why Hannah's family started leaving, and there's a lot of myths in that part of our story too. You guys need to come around and see. Come on, don't be bad. Get over there. And so, as it turns out, the older married kids that are members, especially Dominicus and William, they follow the directive and leave. Hannah has a couple of unmarried kids that are marriage age. And I know she's worried. She wants them married in the church. And so she sends Eliza and John Harrison with William and Dominicus to go to Kirtland. They're the ones that go to Kirtland. John and Hannah don't. John still got jobs down here in Newry till 1838. He couldn't have gone to Kirtland. It's impossible. And so we know that he was still there. The family starts moving out, and there's less children now at home. Of course, some had been already getting married as it was. Some of his children that married didn't join the church, but the ones that did left. And when did John finally leave Newry? That's the big question. We can find a definitive answer. I can tell you when he left within 30-day period, because in the news, in the town records, it said on the 10th of September, 1838. Now, William and Dominicus had been gone for 2 years. On the 10th of September, 1838, John called a town meeting. He was the constable and tax collector, and he got paid $1.50 for his expenses. Okay. Now, this is the 10th of September, 1838. The next monthly meeting was on the 25th of October, 1838, and they had to elect a new constable and tax collector because John had vacated his office. So somewhere in that window of a month, John and Hannah and the children that remained at home left, which essentially was Richard and Mary Jane. So Mary Jane, Richard, John, and Hannah left. And they made good time. Now you got to realize William and Dominicus are poor. I mean, they have nothing. We know the story of William with the one ox going from Kirtland to Missouri. We've all heard that story. Okay. John makes it to Missouri in record time. In less than 2 months later, he's buying property in Monroe County, Missouri. Now, John's not a big fan of the church. We know that. Beats doctor bills, right? But that's about it. Well, over here in yellow is Caldwell County. That's the center of the Mormon settlement. John didn't move there. He moved to Missouri, but he moved to Monroe County, way over here, just barely into the state, 3 counties over, or the 4th county to the west, east of Caldwell. He was no dummy. By the time he got there, the extermination order had been issued. The saints were being driven out. His family was being chased out of Caldwell County by the time he finally arrived in 1838. He wasn't going to get messed up in that. And so he appeased Hannah to a degree. He got her to Missouri, so she was within traveling distance of seeing the family at least. But he stayed over in Monroe. How do we know that? He bought property. He bought property there, like right after he arrived. So within a month or so of his arrival, he had property in Monroe. The purple is where Mary Jane Dooley's husband lived. Mary Jane, who would later marry Dooley. The yellow is where John bought his property. So the Dooleys and the Carters were just a couple of miles apart from each other. And we know that's our John that bought that property because that handwritten document in the bottom is Mary Jane Dooley's wedding record. Whoa, I blew that. Leaning on the wrong page. Come on.
Missionary work was going on.
Okay. Whoa, that's bad. Let's see, screen 2. Not what we want now. Bad news. This is the fun of technology, folks. Stop share. Screen share.
So it says that he died at Burleyville.
Yep, that guy. Say share down here.
Yeah, but it's- yeah, yeah. Yeah, didn't come over.
Let's see, it's your settings, right?
Not sure. Then the share section.
So I think that is screen 2, but I just think we're not presenting on screen 2. How do we? Let's see if we say.
All this because I had a name on it.
There we go.
Okay.
We back?
So anyway, the document down in the bottom corner is in fact Mary Jane's license, where Mary Jane Carter married Jacob Dooley, and Mary Jane had to get permission from her father to sign it or to get married. So it says John Carter gave permission for Mary Jane to get married because she was only 17. And so that's the two proofs that we have that John actually did live in Monroe County. Okay, so now John didn't stay there forever. The rest of the family that were LDS had already moved up to Illinois and were living in the Morleyville area, Morley settlement. And John and Hannah finally get there. I think what was going on was the fact that Hannah has one child left at home, Richard, and he's getting to be marriage age. And here we go again. Is he going to marry a non-member again like Mary Jane did? That's what's going to happen if she stays in Missouri. And so she somehow prevailed on John. And I can imagine how the story goes. So John, you know, the family's living down in that Morley settlement. It's over 30 miles from Nauvoo. You'll be safe down there. There'll be no problems down there. And John probably bought into it, or he just got tired of being, you know, harangued all the time, badgered all the time by his wife, and finally decided to move. So in 1841, they finally moved to Walker Township, where all the rest of the Carters lived. The map, you see all those numbers and colors, those are properties owned by the different members of the family, and time's going fast, so we really don't have a lot of time to go into who owns what. John mainly, see if my mouse, no, it's not in there right now. John mainly owned this property. And right here we need Morley settlement. The Morley settlement, though, was not that little community. The Morley settlement was a large area of farmland. It was a place where this was one of the bread baskets for Nauvoo. This is where the people of Nauvoo got their grains, their corn and wheat and things like that from settlements all around out in the outskirts. Morley settlement was just one of them. Okay, so Morley settlement really covered all this property you see there, not just the 1 square mile down in the corner where all the colors are, where the Carters seem to own practically all of Walker Township, but also those other townships that you see, and even up beyond and out from there. And so John bought his land from William. William had bought the property first, and he sold it to John. And then as the Saints left, John bought back many of the properties that the family owned. He bought it back for a fraction of the cost that they paid for it too. He didn't give them much of a break. His prices were just about like the rest of the people that were selling. John's getting older at this point. He's in his 50s. So you would imagine he didn't do much farming on his own, probably relied on the family to help him and to care to his needs and things like that. And then of course things got ugly. And it didn't take long, about 3 years. We have some things from this time period. There's a picture of the Isaac Morley home in the Morley settlement. That can't be the original home, because the original home was burned in the 1840s. There were no cameras there, so that was obviously a recreation of the Isaac Morley home. But it's probably very similar to what John lived in. So this is probably the kind of home that John owned. But problems got ugly, things got bad. See who wrote this. In Hannah's life story, this is what it says. In the space of 5 years, fertile farms had been developed and the community was a virtual hive of industry. On the 15th of June, 1844, a mob of 2,000 men, headed by the bitter anti-Mormon Colonel Levi Williams, came upon the Saints at Morley settlement and ordered them to make a choice of one of 3 alternatives. These were the choices they were given. First, they could take up arms and join the mob and go with them to Nauvoo and capture Joseph Smith and 12 others that they wanted. Or they could abandon their home and move to Nauvoo. Or they could give up their arms and remain neutral. They gave them an hour to decide what to do. And fortunately, what the Saints did at that point is they fled to Nauvoo. That was the choice that was made at that point. The homes were spared. What they did is they would sneak back and farm, gather the stuff on wagons and head back to Nauvoo real quick and try to avoid any mobs and getting caught. This is how Edmund Durfee got killed. He was doing that, sneaking back and forth, trying to get food for the people in Nauvoo. Okay, so eventually they moved back. And from William Pillsbury's life story, that on the 10th of September, 1845, another mob bent on destruction came upon the settlement of Morleyville. For 8 days and nights, they fired upon the settlers, burned between 70 and 80 homes, all of their stacks of hay and grain, shops, and other buildings. The inhabitants were forced out into the cold night in a drenching rain. We've heard that before in our family stories. The aged, the sick, and the little ones suffered greatly. Brigham Young and the leaders advised them to abandon their homes and possessions to the mob, but to save as many of their families as they could, and again flee to Nauvoo. Teams of wagons were sent from Nauvoo to assist them. Now, in all of this, William never mentions anything about his dad's property. What happened to his dad? Well, fortunately, thanks to Joe Conover, back in Nauvoo, who's our cousin through Philip Lindsay, and also Elijah Coon, through Amanda. through the Tripp family. His grandfather, who was a grandson of Philip Libby, said in his life story, talking about the states, the John of Hamlet, he says, with the band of colonists, they came westward to Hancock County at an early day, and were the owners of a cottage which was torn down during the attack made upon the Mormons by the settlers in this part of the state. It would have to be presumed that they then moved either to Nauvoo or more likely to the homestead of Mary Jane Carter Dooley or Amanda Carter Tripp. So we finally do have an absolute account of somebody who would know, because Philip lived there shortly after all this happened. That John's property, John's home was on Philip's property. That the mobs had burned it down or torn it down, and he moved somewhere. I don't think he went to Nauvoo. I think he went to Mary Jane's. And we'll see why in a minute here. So in Dominicus' story, it says, Canaanite Libby Carter, Dominicus' mother, passed her lot with the saints nearly 12 years previously in the waters of Bear River and moved. Somehow she had managed to keep the family together through all the troubles in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. Which wasn't actually true because they were pretty well scattered. Now, however, her non-member children and husband refused to go further. John elected to stay at Morley Settlement, and there he died. Hannah came west of Dominicus and was buried in the Provo City Cemetery. Well, not really, but later buried in the Provo City Cemetery. Before leaving Nauvoo, she was sealed for time and eternity to Isaac. And so this brings us up to that time period when they left. John chose to stay. He most likely stayed with Mary Jane. It's strange. He was alive in 1850. I'll give $100 to anybody who can find him on that census. I have looked and looked. I've tried everything I could think of, looking for wrong names, wrong anything. I can't find anybody that could be him. Okay, how do we know when he died? Well, William took this little trip around the world and came back to see what was left of his family in Nauvoo in 1852, or actually 1854. And in a letter he wrote on the 5th of February, 1854, he says, Dad died in Illinois, Hancock County on the 13th of August 13th, 1852. I'm choked up enough for that reason. Okay, so his will was the last thing we have of his. It's really a fun will because he neglected to mention his wife and his 6 children joined the church. The only people mentioned in it are the family that didn't join the church. He gave Amanda $5, he gave Philip $5, and he gave Mary Jane everything else. But he didn't give it to Mary Jane. He was old school, because in the old days, women couldn't own property. So what he did is he gave the land and all the property he had to Mary Jane as a life gift, which meant on her death, it had to go somewhere else. And of all people, he picked his 5-year-old grandson to be the inheritor. Why that son? I have no idea. Okay, the last question. Where was he buried? We had fun with that one. And again, thank heavens to our non-LDS relatives that live back in the Nauvoo area, because Philip's descendants, they have a cemetery on their property. We thought maybe he was buried there, but that property wasn't used as a cemetery until 1876. Well, there's no way John could have been buried there in 1852. But Philip's family said that he was buried in the Fletcher Cemetery. I'd never understood where Fletcher was. Fletcher was a family, by the way. It's a little family cemetery that's long been abandoned. The township took it over, so it's maintained. The Fletcher Cemetery is right down the road that way on the map, 1.5 miles from where Mary Jane lived on the same road. It makes so much sense. So we as an organization decided we would put up a marker. We raised money. Many of you may have helped contribute to this marker. So then we had to have a place to put it. So I wrote to the township headquarters and they said, well, we manage this particular cemetery because it's really abandoned. And I said, can we put a gravestone up? And they said, sure, pick a spot and you can put the gravestone up. And they're not charging us for anything. They just said, you pick a spot, as long as the family doesn't own it, we'll let you put a stone up anywhere you want in there, because there was a lot of unused area in that farm, in that cemetery. Well, the story gets better than that. I thought that was funny. So now we have to figure out where. So I've got Joe, who lives back there, and he's the one running this thing, Joe Conover. I hope, Joe, I hope you're watching. I hope I tell the story right. And the owner of Harrison Monuments, Mr. Harrison, comes out with a witching stick. No lie, with a witching stick. And he says, I've used this in a lot of cemeteries to find where bodies are buried. And he says, we're going to use this witching stick to find the spot. And so they went, and he knew from historical records what part of that cemetery was the earliest part. And so that's why where you see the stone today, that was the early part of the cemetery. And they started walking up and down the rows with this witching stick, saying John Carter, John Carter, John Carter, until the thing dipped. And no lie, I'm telling you the story. I believe Joe, he's 80 plus years old. He's not going to be lying to me. He and Mr. Harrison both did this, and they both got the dip at the same location in the cemetery. And so that's where the John Stone is there today. And I hope that you'll get a chance to go back there and see the stone. It's really a very pretty stone. And I had a lot of fun with them because, you know, we have 2 John Harrisons. And they called me twice trying to say, you really want 2 John Harrisons on there? There's a list of all the children are on the back. And I said, yeah. And there were 2 of them, so we're going to put both of them on there. It's not going to cost me any more. Just carve the 2 names in there. And so they did. Okay, well, to sum this up, I pulled this out of a excellent written book or story on Dominicans, where he talks about John, and he says, let us be kind in our judgment to those who stayed in Illinois. John Carter was at the time nearly 64 years old. Though he was not of the faith, his love for his wife and family had steeled him to endure the same hardships as they. And I think that sums up John much better than most of us have ever felt about him. And that's the life of John, given on his 170th birth or death date today, which I thought was very appropriate. Thank you.